up a bit. I'm having trouble hearing. Yeah, okay. Now you can hear better? Is this better? Better sound? Or you want it? I can turn it up more. That's only at 50%. This is at 80%. And yeah, okay. What we're going to do today is 100%. So we were last week in this course, we covered the first part for individuals of Article 4, the residency. We are going to start from there, dealing with tiebreaker and walking into corporation residency, what establishes the jurisdiction to tax, which is really a principles of international tax issue. But for the tax treaties purpose, we saw that in our Articles 1 through 3 that we had these steps. Step 1, you had to, obviously you had to be a party to a treaty. One of the countries had to be a party, but I mentioned that we would discuss what's called triangular issues dealing with permanent establishments. That's mainly banking. And that would be covered by Michael Rinaldi in the context of, by example, real estate investments cross-border at a later stage. But generally speaking, you have two countries that are a party to the tax treaty. You must be connected to one of those countries. Your client must be connected to one of those countries by having residency established there. And residency, as we saw from the beginning of Article 4, and I'm going to go ahead and as I'm talking, I'm going to open up Article 4 in the commentary. But last week what I did was I used Article 4 directly from the OECD website. I went to the OECD website and I pulled it down for free. This week we're going to use CCH just as a different experience. And as the lectures go on and the weeks go on, I'm going to continue to find our treaties through different means so that, excuse me, I have a little bit of my throat's still sore from the weekend. I'm going to continue to find the information that we want through various channels that we have access to, just to show you a look-feel for those various channels. For those of you who sat in yesterday's classes, we covered yesterday seems so far away all of a sudden. We covered the Worldwide Tax and Investment Law Database, and we covered I don't even remember what we covered the first database, but I do know I taught 4 hours yesterday, so I pretty thoroughly dived into those databases. The first 2 hours was in Thesis 1. Now, I'm going to the proxy server first. So for those of you, just as a touch base memory, how did I do proxy server? Well, yesterday what I did was I went to my Connect 2, and so you're going to see it slowly on your screen. I went to my Connect 2, and as you'll see on your screen, I have it memorized in there, TJSL students, and that's my proxy server. So all I had to do was go click on it. Now I've already done that, so I'm not going to go click on it right now. It'll take me off. So on your screen at this very moment, this is how I connect to my proxy server. By moving over, clicking, and then my proxy server's on. Once my proxy server's on, I click on the link for the databases at the library, the student.tgsl. Well, anyway, you know what the link is. So I have to use a different link because I'm a faculty member, and my link is numbers, not letters, not alphabet. So I click on my database link, my law library link, which I have saved into my favorites. So yesterday I just showed you, rather than typing in the link, remembering it, okay, that's my faculty link up there. You'll see on the board now, and it's numbers. It won't work for you. You have to have a faculty ID. Yours is actually better link. Mine only allows one access at a time, that being me, and it has to authenticate against my computer because I can actually manipulate the login information for these databases. So in my case, what I've done is I showed you yesterday, but since Mark LaRue wasn't there, I'll do this for him, and I've saved it into my favorites. So somewhere here I have Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson, there it is. So I would click on my Thomas Jefferson, and down at the bottom of the screen, and you'll see that in a moment on your screen. And in my Thomas Jefferson, I have my link to the databases saved. This is by far the easiest way to get to your databases. Oh, and I've seen they've updated the databases because it's now no longer called Tax, it's called Tax International Tax. So that must have happened in the last 30 minutes. So I click on my link, and here I am at my databases, and the databases have been updated, Tax International Tax, so I click on that. That means that IBFD has probably been updated in the checkpoint as of today also. Butterworth's was updated yesterday, and there's Butterworth's at the top, sure, there it is. So Butterworth's is on here, and for those of you who are doing Butterworth assignments, there's Butterworth's, and we're going to cover Butterworth's one more time tomorrow. Ravi says, I neither hear nor see anything on my screen. Well, I'm using a student screen also. I have two computers, Ravi, and I see... Well, you can't hear me if I'm talking. Okay, I'm going to have to... Yes, it is. I can't respond to Ravi. If I do, I have to shut down what I'm doing. Tell Ravi to log out and re-enter. Will you type for Ravi to log out and then re-enter the classroom? It is probably a bandwidth issue. But to make sure, right now I'm teaching you on low bandwidth. I wanted to test this out. So right now I'm teaching you on a wireless connection on my laptop. I am not using T1 line, I'm not using DSL, I'm not using cable. So it may be a bandwidth issue, but Mega Meeting does not require a high bandwidth. I'm on literally a poor connection right now, and so you hear my voice and you see the screen based off me projecting from a poor connection. I just want you all to be aware of that. And Ravi can email Mega Meeting, and they can take his computer over. But I can't stop the class because I'll have to shut down everything, and I'm on a poor connection anyway, so I can't take his computer over. Okay, so you see the Butterworth's up there on the screen. I'm clearing that. I'm now going to go to CCH, and and I don't think it's a bandwidth issue, because if it was a bandwidth issue, I would be having an issue right now using a very poor wireless connection that's working at about 40 Mbps as opposed to my normal connection. And now I'm going to click on CCH. Before I click on CCH, if it's your first time, you're going to want to copy a user ID and password. So I already have one memorized. These have multiple users. It's not two users, they're just two different passwords in case one isn't working for some reason. And I'm going to click on CCH. And on my screen, CCH is going to open up. In my case, as you're going to see on your screen in a moment, I have memorized in one of the passwords by clicking Remember My Password on this computer. So you're going to see this in a moment. I'll wait till it's on the screen. Yeah, I'm noticing a little bit more latency using this wireless connection, but I need to see the difference. Okay, so I'm going to click enter. As you saw, remember my password on this computer. That's what you want to do, so CCH is memorized in there. You still need to go through the VPN to authenticate, or otherwise it won't open up. You're going to see CCH open on your screen, and I'm going to go to the Tax Treaties OECD model by clicking on International Tax, the top tab. So I'll try and type to Ravi, but I don't think it can easily work. Email. What is it? Email mega meeting. Okay, so International Tax tab is circled in red at the top of your screen. I'm going to click it now. We're going to find in the center of my screen Treaties. We've been here before, like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. Tax Treaties and Analysis in the center of my screen. So I'm circling that in red. I could do a search right now and search out treaties or issues with treaties, or search through these various treatises like Fogel that we use to teach in this class. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go strictly to what I need, which is the OECD Model Treaty. The OECD Model Treaty is in the right-hand side of my screen, circled in red. I'm going to wait till this is on your screen. Okay, it's on my student screen now. I see my red appearing. The OECD Model Treaty and commentaries condensed in full version. Everyone should see that now on the right-hand side in the center column. And in red, I'm clicking on it. I have two choices at the top. Capital and commentary, condensed, convention on income tax, full version. Excuse me. I'm going to go to the full version. So I've clicked on that. And I have at the top a full version, and then I have my commentaries. I assume everyone's read the commentary for Article 4. And now I'm going to I'm not going to read the introduction. I'll look at the table of contents, Article 4, just so I can see my first 3 articles as a map of where we're going. Okay, so Article 1 we covered last week, the persons covered. We talked about companies, trusts, REITs, that kind of thing. We've talked about that before. Article 2, taxes covered. We said estate taxes, by example, are not covered because they have their own treaty. They have an OECD model estate tax treaty, which is covered in the International Estate Planning course. And several countries have estate and gift tax treaties, such as the United States and France, such as the United States and Britain, such as the United States and Canada, such as Britain and France, and so on. General definitions we looked at last week. What is a company? What is a person? Things like that. We went very slowly through the article, and then we started Article 4, and we spent an hour and a half deciphering basically the first sentence of Article 4, which is very normal for a tax treaties class to do. So we're going to move on to the tiebreaker clause in Article 4. Now, I'm scrolling back to the top of my screen, and I'm going to link back by clicking on. So this is the best way to do it. Do not use your back button because it screws up the your authentication, and it might lock you out of this, not lock you, but log you out, and then you need to log back in. So I'm just going to the top of my screen, and you'll see it circled in red. I'm going to click on the link, and there, it's circled in red. So you see that. I'm going to click on the link. It's going to bring me back to where I was. I'm going to now click on the third link, which is the full version of the convention. Is 230, says Robbie. Well, I guarantee you that I'm only using... Okay. Huh. No, I'm faster than that, but I'm using a slow one by American standards. 230. I don't know, but he said he was using broadband also. Anyway, if you can chat to Ravi again, just tell him he has to email Mega Meeting and or call Mega Meeting, and they'll sort out his computer immediately. But I won't know how to do it. Okay. Article 2, taxes covered. Scrolling back down, Article 3. And here we back are at Article 4. So Article 4 is going to appear in the center of your screen. And you'll see Article 4 on your screen in a moment. Okay, so what we did last week is we covered the first sentence of Article 4, and we looked at each word in the context of the other sentences. So I'm highlighting it on my screen. We covered this part of Article 4. And Hale Stewart, on the tiebreaker clause, you're supposed to move through them sequentially to determine residency. That's 100% correct. They are sequential. And they are not a, by example, totality of factors. One of them, the economic connection center of vital interest, which is B, does examine several factors, but sequentially it absolutely comes after A. Okay, so you see highlighted on your screen what we've dealt with. The second part of this sentence is in your course notes that you buy from IBLS. It's deciphered there for you extensively, referring to innumerable sources. You'll find that in your course notes, so we're not covering it in class, the second part of the first paragraph. Moving on to the second paragraph, where by reason of paragraph 1 is resident of both contracting states. Now, resident of both contracting states. So, by example, I am a U.S. national. The U.S. tax code defines U.S. taxpayers as U.S. nationals. So I am always resident of the United States for tax purposes, whether I never step foot in the United States in my entire lifetime. So let's say that I am also an Israeli, and I was born in the U.S. to two Israeli parents. They fly back to Israel, and I serve in the Israeli military, and I've never stepped foot in the U.S. Technically, I'm still a U.S. taxpayer. Technically, as a U.S. taxpayer, I have an obligation to file a tax return every single year and to pay tax above my exemption amount should I choose to elect my exemption of the $80,000 for earned income. So I would, for instance, owe tax to the U.S. government on passive income, which I may receive a credit for my Israeli taxes paid or other countries' taxes paid. Tough luck. The tax treaty, in theory, is supposed to sort that out. Now, for those of you who are in the U.S., and we will cover this in this class pretty extensively at a later date, but as a heads up, because I'm making generalizations and I'm not talking about the exceptions at this stage of the game, but for those of you from the U.S., be aware that the U.S., and this is covered in your materials by Michael Edwards Kerr, the U.S. has something called a savings clause. I'm going to write that on the board so that you can go look it up in the U.S. treaty. Last week, Hale said, what's the difference between the U.S. model and the OECD? Well, the most important difference is the savings clause. And the savings clause is something that you can go look up now or read about it in your course notes. So I'm writing it. Savings is in bank savings and like a savings account. So a savings clause. And the savings clause says this treaty does not allow U.S. people not to pay U.S. tax. Savings clause. It doesn't literally say that. You'll read it on your own. But the effect, or at least the desired outcome by Treasury in putting that clause into the treaty is that they don't want U.S. people to be able to slip out of U.S. tax liability as a result of a treaty that the U.S. has entered into. That is totally different from every other country in the world. Only the U.S. does that. And if you don't like it, talk to your congressman. So, now, so in my case of the U.S.-Israel, I'm resident in Israel because I live in Israel full-time, have a house and so forth. I'm resident in the United States because I'm a U.S. taxpayer. Second situation, I'm a UK national who actually lives in London like a banker, and I come over to the United States to work on a 2-year secondment with my bank. While I'm in the U.S., I have to have a work permit. I can't just show up and illegally work. Thus, because we're all in compliance, so I get my green card. I get a 2-year H-1B. The U.S. tax code says a U.S. tax person is a national, a holdover work permit, like a green card, residency permit, or an H-1B. Any country in the world is going to have some type of rule that makes you resident based on your work permit. That, of course, only applies to countries that tax based on residency. Because last week we mentioned that a lot of countries don't tax based on residency, such as Hong Kong and Singapore. In fact, most of Asia and most of Latin America tax based on source principles. We dealt with that last Friday. Not source principle, we just dealt with the fact that there is a such thing as a source principle, and we started to get deeply involved in it, but we're not finished that discussion. So I could be resident of the UK by nature of my nationality there, by nature that I live there, but now I have a green card in the that's taking me to the US. Either to become a dual resident, to become, that is, resident in both countries where both countries are going to impose full taxation on me. So in our step process, we said step 1, you have to have a treaty apply if we're talking about tax treaties. And Michael Edwards Kerr has his test, and this is not the same thing because you're talking about treaty interpretation. This is about whether you have an issue at all. So, so stepping back even to the principles course, the international tax course, not the treaties course, step one is, first of all, we have to have a tax problem. So a tax issue. And to have a tax issue, we have to have one country trying to impose its tax upon your client. If only one country is attempting to impose tax upon your client, well, you at least have a domestic tax issue, but you don't really have a cross-border issue. You can deal with it in a cross-border manner, like using offshore to create deductions and so forth, which we started to talk about in the last 2 weeks, and very hardcore in particular last week under the source discussion. However, from a tax treaty perspective, we do not have a tax treaty issue if only one country is seeking to impose taxation. And, or at least in theory we don't. Actually, with sophisticated tax treaty planning, or we purposely interject a treaty into the situation, we create a tax treaty issue, even when one would not be there under obvious circumstances. So we have our one country imposing tax, such as the UK, because I'm living there right now and I'm working there, and I grew up there. So under the UK domicile test and under the UK residency test, both tests, I'm a UK taxpayer. And I'm paying taxes on my income from whatever source, whether it's foreign source, local source, whether it's capital, or whether it's income. I now have a US green card. Let's say that my green card starts January 1st. Well, I got the issue of timing to deal with because the UK tax year does not start January 1st like the United States tax year starts. The UK has a different tax year. So the US, starting January 1st, because I now have a work permit, will be wanting to collect its full taxation upon my income for the year, let's call it year 2008. Well, the UK also is going to want to collect its full tax burden upon my income for the period of the year 2008 that I'm a UK resident. At some part of the year 2008 that is the new UK tax year, then, and does anyone know off your head? I forget. So I have so many tax years in my head. Does the UK start March 1st or April 1st, the tax year? I can't remember when the budget speech comes out in the UK. In South Africa, it's a month difference. So either the UK budget speech comes out February 28th or it comes out March 31st. Does anyone in the class remember? April. Okay. So the UK tax year starts April. So it must be a March 31st budget. Budget speech. So for that first quarter, January, February, March, I'm still a UK full tax resident. And that doesn't mean that I won't be a UK tax resident April, May, and so on, just because I'm now a tax resident in the US. Yeah, it would be the same as Jamaica because of the Commonwealth system. And funny enough, because South Africa moved its budget and tax year up a month. I know why, because the summer, because it's a different season there. Summer's in November, December, January. That's why South Africa did that. Just because my client no longer, or just because the U.S. has imposed residency taxation upon my banker client in my hypothet doesn't mean that he's no longer a UK resident. Let's say, by example, that my client is in the US with his work permit, H-1B, working for a bank, but he's really traveling back and forth to London. He's being paid by the US, but in fact, he may have a dual contract. He may be paid by both employers. He may be paid by the US bank, and he may be paid by the English bank. He may be paid by the English bank, by example, as a director. And he's paid by the US bank as an executive management to sort out some problem, like a compliance problem. This has been very realistically happening in the last few years because of the U.S. Patriot Act and foreign countries having to send directors over to sort out U.S. local problems to appease the regulators. Now, here I have a dual resident problem. So, what is my step one tax issue? So I got my step one, and I have my my tax, and my tax is going to be residency based, i.e., worldwide income taxation, and this is a U.S. imposition of tax. So you're going to see on your board, I've just written my little symbols. I talked last week about the symbols we use in tax language and tax code in tax class. So step one, we don't normally write step one, of course. We don't put an S1. So we have my tax, residency US, and I have tax, residency UK. Now, for company, this is normally, you're going to see on the board in a short moment, written with a rectangle with a diagonal line across it, and on one side it's going to say US, and on the other side of the rectangle it's going to say UK. And that means both countries are imposing residency taxation upon my company. You can't really use it because literally for people, generally we draw a stick figure. You can't really put a rectangle through my stick figure and like that, but anyway, some people have my little stick figure, and then on each side of the stick figure they would have US and UK as my double taxation, or two countries seeking to impose taxation. And if you had a third country imposing residency taxation, like your kids are in school in France, you're in a home in France, they'd put it on top of their head. And that would mean a triple resident, and that does happen actually, because in Europe. Now, so the US is imposing full taxation, the UK is imposing full taxation. Paragraph 2 steps in and says, in this situation, to alleviate double taxation, which is the true purpose of the treaty, it's a tax convention to alleviate double taxation. And then they threw in the words later on, and to prevent tax avoidance. But to alleviate double taxation, excuse me, we'll look at subparagraph A of paragraph 2. The first sentence starts, he shall be deemed So remember under our source discussion Friday, the word deeming, where a statute overlays the jurisprudence. And so even though jurisprudence, or even just pure old-fashioned logic, may state that a transaction, the income from a transaction, that we need to determine the source of, and last week we looked at the different sources of income for a transaction, and we wrote like little d's, or we wrote the little determinant factors, little f's, and we said one of them is going to be dominant, and that dominant source is going to determine wherever that dominant factor criteria for that particular type of income is created from a transaction, that would be the place of source of the income, and the place of source then became the one that had the right to tax it. However, countries would deem the source to be elsewhere based on their fisc needs, based on how much money they need to collect. So here the treaty uses the word deem. So regardless of what the local law says, regardless of the domestic law, that's why this is a tiebreaker test. He's only going to be deemed at his only one country, and then he uses the word only. He shall be deemed to be resident. Resident allows you to impose your full taxation only of the state. So, deemed means this article, no matter what the local law says, anti-avoidance, it doesn't matter. This article overlays the local law and suppresses it. And last week I said, from a very complex point of view, treaties don't tell countries that they don't have the right to tax. Treaties actually suppress the right to collect tax. They don't suppress the right to levy tax. They suppress the right to collect tax. So the treaty's not saying, in my example of the US-UK, for my UK individual, and we haven't set the facts out where he has a permanent home yet in this example, but whichever country he may have a permanent home in, this treaty is not stating that that country may not actually levy tax. That country still has a jurisdiction, still has a sovereign right to have a tax bill. However, it may not collect it. That's really what the treaty does. Yeah. So, only of the state in which he has a permanent home available to him. So there's my first part of my tiebreaker test. Now, for those of you in the States, you're of course going to want to go see if the U.S. model Article 4 tiebreaker test has the same subparagraph A. How would I do that? Well, I'm going to do it for you right now on my screen, but I'm not going to do it in CCH because I want my screen to stay up. I could do it in CCH because the U.S. model treaty is here in CCH also. So what I'm going to do is quickly go over to my link, I'm going to open up Tax Analyst for you. Under my database link, if I can find it. And if I can find it, I will not open it up. Okay, there. Okay, so I'm running over to Tax Analyst by clicking on Tax International Tax. You're going to see this on your screen in a moment. I'm back in my VPN, opening up a totally separate second screen. I'm clicking on Tax Analyst. I'll wait until the screen's up on your board. I'm having a good 10-second latency here. Okay. So the proxy server should be showing up on your board in a moment. Are y'all having a same slow latency? Do you all see Tax Analyst yet? Yeah. You're at the screen I'm at right now. So click on Tax Analyst. Yeah. No, it's a low latency. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to use wireless to teach on anymore, but I needed to see how it impacts y'all receiving it. Okay, so oops. I've clicked on Tax Analyst. It's opening up. I don't need a password for it again, as we've been through Tax Analyst before. Not Mark LaRue. He hasn't been through it because he's in the other course, International Taxation. But I'm going to go into Worldwide Tax Treaties. I click on Worldwide Tax Treaties under Tax Analyst. We've been here before. To save myself time, rather than looking at all the treaties, yada yada, I know I just need to go to Model Treaties and Model Conventions. So I'm going to click right on the Model Conventions on my left-hand side, or I could go look at a real U.S. treaty, but I'm going to go look at the U.S. Model Treaty for purposes of our class. Underneath Model Conventions on the left-hand side of my screen, we'll see I can go look at the U.S. legislative history of treaties too. Here's another way to get to my OECD model. On the top of your screen, you see Model Tax Convention, OECD. You see Model Estate Inheritance and Gifts Convention, OECD. But I'm scrolling down. You see United Nations, but I'm going to the U.S. Model Treaty. By the way, Netherlands has a model treaty. I do not know why Tax Analyst does not put the Netherlands model treaty on the board here. Michel van Roon, for instance, who's from the Netherlands, but he practices in Switzerland. I'm sure he uses a lot of Netherlands companies in his planning. Well, then obviously he's going to want to make sure he studies the Dutch Model Tax Treaty also. Anyway, so Model Tax Convention on Income, adopted by the United States on November 15th, 2006. So in the last year. Before that, it was the, as you see, 1996. So I'm clicking on the one that was adopted in the last 9 months. You're going to see that on your screen in a moment. I'm clicking on the little arrow so I can see all the parts of the convention. You're going to see that on your screen in a moment. And obviously, I'm interested in Article 4. So I'm going to click on Article 4. Although, I might as well, since we're here. Now we'll deal with savings directive another time. Okay. Okay. So here I am at my Article 4, United States, and now I can flip back and forth between CCH, OECD model, and US under here Tax Analyst model. And now, as a note, I'm sure everybody here has read this US model, because I said to last week in class. Oops, maybe in CCH. First of all, a big difference between the US model and the OECD model I've just opened the OECD model again on my screen from CCH, and we read, by reason of his domicile, residence, place of management, and other criterion. Well, as I've already said, U.S. tax law defines a resident as a national, as somebody who's a citizen, therefore. And so you're going to see on your screen in a moment the OECD model again, which I've circled in green. Domicile, residence, place of management, or other criterion of similar nature. And it's going really slow because it's not on your screen yet. Anyway, for purposes of the U.S. model, it says domicile, residence, and there you see it. Citizenship. So the U.S. also throws in place of incorporation and yada yada. Now, you'll notice that the U.S., under its paragraph, I saw CCH flip there for a second, and it's already back to tax analysts. Okay. Now, notice the U.S. paragraph 2. The term resident of a contracting state includes a pension fund, a charity, a 501c3. Does the OECD model have that? No. The OECD model, paragraph 2, is the tiebreaker model. So the United States has a paragraph 2 that establishes the residency includes a pension fund and a charity. Why? Why does it need for the U.S. side of the equation to put that in there? It needs to put that in there because the previous articles defined a person, but they don't mention the word pension fund. It doesn't mention the word 501c3 or an organization that is established and maintained exclusively for blah 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 charity purposes. So the U.S. likes to spell it out so that other countries understand that the U.S. is going to demand this in its treaties. Well, every country in the world has pension funds anyway. So the U.S. just feels the need to spell it out here because pension funds generally are not taxable. And if they're not taxable, then under the second sentence of paragraph 1 in the OECD model and the U.S. model, this term does not include any person who's liable to tax only of income with sources of that state. Further, in the previous, persons don't include persons who aren't subject to tax necessarily. And pension funds in most countries are not subject to tax. They're tax exempt. And charities are generally speaking tax exempt. So they would never fall into the protection of a tax treaty. And last week I said, and Marshall Langer is a big, he's very much against this and says we could pay for the Iraq war if countries would tax each other's governments. Like the Chinese have billions of dollars of investments in treasury bills through the Chinese government, which is really pension fund money in many cases for the Chinese laborers. And anyway, that's why there's a Section 2 here in the U.S. treaty. Yes, correct, Mark. That would be covered because there is this article. The UBTI would be also protected pursuant to the treaty a good example would be a U.S. charity. Tax Analyst is actually a 501c3. Tax Analyst, the company, is a 501c3, and thus it is exempt from U.S. taxation, even though obviously its unrelated business income is subject to taxation under the code. However, the company itself is not subject to taxation. The income unrelated to the charitable purpose is subject to taxation, but not the company. The company is exempt from taxation under 501c3. Thus, tax analysts would have no treaty protection in dealing with other countries with which the United States has a tax treaty, by example, Holland, UK, and so forth. But because of this clause, this paragraph this paragraph 2 in the U.S. model that's going to be in every U.S. treaty, tax analysts will enjoy the protection of the treaty, and thus even its unrelated business income, which generally speaking will be profit-making, by example, selling these databases overseas, that will also be protected under the treaty from taxation of the foreign country. Now, the tiebreaker clause then is paragraph 3 of the U.S. treaty model, and I'm going to circle he shall be deemed, that's the same word, to be a resident only of the state, okay, this is all the same language, in which he has a permanent home available to him. So, paragraph 3A starts off the exact same as the OECD model, just numbered differently because of this paragraph 2 in the U.S. model treaty. So, and you'll see as you read on that the ending of paragraph A is the same as the ending in, I keep calling it paragraph A, of subsection A of paragraph 3 is the same ending as subsection A of paragraph 2 in the OECD model. Oh, flip back for you. Okay, so your screen should be on the OECD model right now. It'll flip back in a moment. So here we have the OECD and the US following each other substantially. Because, as I said, the only time the US model is going to derogate from the OECD model is based on our little nuances in our tax code. And generally speaking, all countries have put those nuances as exceptions to the rule directly into the OECD model treaty under the commentary. And in this case, you'll see below on your screen that the commentary is directly here. Sorry, the history is directly here. Not the commentary. The commentary I have to go click on the commentary link. But it's directly below Article 4 that we're looking at now. So, permanent home. Well, of course, I have to know the definition of permanent home. I guess the first place I'd look for a definition is in the treaty itself. So I'd go up to Article 3 and see if there's a definition for permanent home. And I'm not going to find one. So I'll scroll up, Article 3. Oh, no permanent home definition. So now where am I going to look? Well, I better go to the commentary. How am I going to get to the commentary? I'm going to have to click on my upper link. Use my back button. So I'm going to to circle. I'm circling the link at the top of the page, and that's what I'm going to go click on, and it's going to allow me to go to the commentary. However, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is go to Tax Analysts, because it has a better interface that allows me to link directly to the commentary. So here I am back on Tax Analysts. You're going to see this on your screen in a moment. I'm going to click on Model Convention. I'm going to click on the OECD Model Convention, the one that we're looking at now, the 2005 that keeps getting updated. It's not on your screen yet. I'm waiting for it to appear on your screen so you can see how I link to the commentaries. Here it is. Okay, I clicked on 2005. You see it at the top of your screen. In your screen in a moment, you're going to see the model convention from the OECD, tax analyst version. And in the middle, you see, I'm circling it now for you, you see commentaries on the articles that they've did there. So I've circled commentaries. And underneath it, last week I told you China, India, South Africa, who aren't members of the OECD, now actually, even though India led the effort for the UN model, they come in and comment on their own exceptions to the OECD model, even though they don't technically vote on the model. And so you see that underneath commentaries, non-member countries' positions. This is why Tax Analysts is the best way to look at tax treaties, as I've already explained to you. But, okay, so now I'm clicking on commentaries on the articles of the model convention. So on your screen, you're going to see article by article the commentaries, and I'm going to click on commentary of Article 4. What am I looking for again? I'm looking for what is a permanent home. So, first I see preliminary remarks. The concept of resident of contracting, Now, I'm going to go directly to the paragraph that we were looking at by scrolling down. The thing you're going to see in Article 4 is a description of what Article 4 is about. Every commentary starts the same. What is this article about? What are the case situations where it occurs? There it's on your screen, so preliminary remarks. Then I scroll down to paragraph 2. It explains to you why there's paragraph 2. That's in sections 9 and 10, which are now on your screen. You see a little note that says amended as of see history. Okay. Looking at number 11, this article gives preference to the contracting state in which the individual has a permanent home available to him. Now let's remember why we're doing this. Michael Edwards Kerr says, step 1, the first thing we do is look to see what the domestic law says. Well, domestic law has imposed taxation on our client in both countries, the UK and the US. This is for our banker. The domestic law does not solve the problem by itself. Both countries impose taxation. Neither country is giving a tax credit for the other country's taxation at this moment. Neither country is giving up its right to impose or collect taxation based on their domestic law under step 1. So now we move to step 2. What does the tax treaty say? The tax treaty says deem. So the tax treaty says the tax treaty is going to decide this for you. In theory, we should need a step 3, but we are going to need a step 3 because Michael Edwards Kerr explains why there's a step 3, because the treaty has to still be interpreted in the context of domestic law interpretation of treaties, just like statutes, and must be applied under the domestic law. So whatever your treaty says still has to be applied in the domestic context by at least one country, that country giving up its right to collect taxation. And last week, we called it the loser country. So, Article 11 gives preference to the contracting state which the individual has a permanent home available to him. Okay, that still doesn't tell me what permanent home means. Is a permanent home, can I lease a house and it's permanent? Does a permanent home mean I have to move all my furniture to the home? What if I buy a condominium in New York, but I don't have any furniture in it? Like, in fact, all I have is a sleeping bag. Is it a permanent home? Is it a permanent home by my mere purchase? But what if I don't purchase it? What if the company purchases it for me and I do not have any property in the United Kingdom? I don't own a home there. I don't have a condo. I don't rent an apartment. So does that make my home permanent by virtue that I don't have another place to hang my hat? Or what if I do have another place to hang my hat, but it's in a vacation villa in Ibiza, Spain? Okay, so I've got to find a definition. This criterion will frequently be sufficient to solve the conflict. So the redactors of the OECD model, and that's the Ministers of Finance and the Treasury Secretary of the United States, or his representatives. This criterion will frequently be sufficient to solve the conflict where the individual has a permanent home. Okay, now we use the same word in one contract and has only made a stay. Okay, now we're looking at some other language. And has only made a stay of some length in the other contracting state. Does that help me define a permanent home? Well, it has to, because it's been written in there. So can I use logic? Can I use statutory, or in this case it's really public international law, treaty, Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties? Can I use that interpretation matter to put these two concepts together? And now, permanent home. So I'm putting a big H. That's my home. A permanent home is not, here's what it is not. It is not made a stay of some length in the other contracting state. Now, the redactors, the writers of this treaty, all our ministers of finance, at least in the very minimalist sense of what is a permanent home, it is not making a stay of some length in the other contracting state. That's a very, very, very weak definition. It's not saying what a permanent home is, but it's at least providing a description of what it cannot be. There are many other things it cannot be also. So for those of you, most of us here are lawyers, and if you're a civil law lawyer, you understand statutory interpretation better than a common law lawyer, because you should start with your general statement, and then from your general statement you would work toward your exceptions and then exceptions to the exceptions in a very orderly, logic way. At least that's the theory of a civil code. In the United States we don't have that, so this is an example of common law, because a civil law would never ever have this kind of minimalist definition or modification of a statute or of a treaty. So here we have permanent home definition. We're looking for at least what is a permanent home, and instead of telling us what a permanent home is, that would be the civil law approach, this next clause of the sentence of the definition of permanent home states what it is not, and it doesn't state everything that it is not. It gives us one minimalist example, one small exception. One might even call it an exception to an exception of what it is not. Why do I say exception to an exception? Because it doesn't say a stay of length. It can't give that. It can't say that for logic reasons. But of some length. So even the end of this clause has a permanent home. Permanent, the word permanent has something to do with time. Time. A home is really what we're looking at the definition for. If everyone understands that, I'm going to get into some in-depth, complex statutory and / treaty interpretation here right now so that everyone gets this concept very clearly. And this is going to apply to your permanent establishment discussion also. So don't blow this off. You're not looking for the definition of permanent right now. We'll look for that second. But permanent is an adjective for this purpose. Home is our noun. Just like I talked about adjectives and nouns with the word income last time. Permanent is a time factor. So if I took the word permanent out of this sentence, I still have my noun, this subject, this home, which doesn't need perhaps, when most of us think of a home, we think of something that is permanent. We think under common linguistics of all societies in every country in the world, we think of a home as where we hang our hat, or whatever the colloquialism is, where our kids live, or the spouse lives, or the white picket fence, or the home is the condo, and the home is where I normally reside, normally habitually, permanent. These are all factors of time. So what I'm really looking for here is what is the definition of home? And the definition of home is then going to be modified. So the logic word here, if you all are into symbolic logic or linguistics for statutory interpretation, and you're going to think, well, I'm never going to come into this situation or case where I have to look at it so deeply. Well, you're so wrong, especially with permanent establishments. How many times in practice I had to get down to these little nitty-gritty details of a definition so that I could explain to a revenue official or to local counsel who had to go explain to a revenue official why what they thought something. Step one, Michael Edwards Kerr. They thought their definition meant something under their domestic law. It took me, step two, to show them that what they thought was a misconception and that there was actually, it meant something different. And people don't want to give up what they think is their meaning. Because under step one, their meaning wasn't correct either, generally speaking, but they thought it was correct under their case law, when it really turned out it wasn't when one really got into the discussion with them. But it took a step two, international law discussion, to arrogate the rights of step one. And then step three, to reapply it for the situation of the client. So we're looking for a definition of home. And the next sentence, in a common law tradition, starts to tell us what a home is not. So the funny part is, now that I've broken it down, that this is not one word, this is really two words, permanent plus home, that is, home, noun, permanent modifier. The statute, this treaty provision, then goes on to talk about the modifier, but it doesn't talk about the home itself, because the stay of some length Well, that's time again. That's a time modifier. So unfortunately, we are no closer to what a home is than we were before we started this discussion. So I move to my number 12. Subparagraph A means, therefore, now for anybody who understands, again, logic, therefore, if I use that word, therefore, it means that it's like an if-then statement in the sense of causation, that I now have two propositions that together necessarily cause a truth or cause a result. So subparagraph A under this section 12 says, because I have two propositions that necessarily create a result, but we don't have two propositions above, as I've just explained to you. So from an actual, like, if you ever go and work for governments, like Onduka from Kenya, who's head of the tax treaties for Kenyan government, if you ever got to talk to the OECD people, this is like screwed up statutory drafting or treaty drafting. But anyway, this is what we have. So subparagraph A means therefore. Well, it doesn't mean anything, therefore, because there's no two propositions above. There's the discussion about a modifier, but that in the application of the convention, okay, when applying our treaty, that is, where there's a conflict between the law of two states, in parentheses, and we've covered that, you can't have a tax treaty issue if there isn't a conflict between two states. That is, two states seeking to impose taxation on the same person or item of income. It is considered the residence, okay, so we're repeating ourselves again, is that place where the individual owns or possesses. Okay, now we have two other words. Owns or possesses. So this is going to modify, and I'm putting these two M's on your board again. You're going to see them in a second. Owns or possesses, and these are going to be little m's. My T, my time modifier, can be a big M or a little m, but for purposes of this statutory construction, I'm going to make it a big M. Where the individual owns or possesses a home, this home must be permanent. That is to say, so this home must be permanent. If it ended there, we'd really have to pull our hair out, because now it's just a tautology of repeating itself over and over again without giving us anything solid to hang our hat on. Must be permanent. That is to say, finally, we're going to get a definition here. And anybody who knows the differences between, like, UK English, Australian English, American English, you know that an American wrote this, and an American common law lawyer. In fact, I can, it's a professor. It's probably, if I have to guess, this is from Boston, because that is to say is a colloquialism used by Americans, not used by other people in their languages. That is to say, the individual must have, okay, now we're going to get to some definition, must have arranged and retained it for permanent, we keep seeing the word permanent, for the permanent use, as opposed to, okay, here's again going back to our number 11 above, what is it not? So permanent is not, it's as opposed to, permanent is not staying at a particular place. So permanent is not staying at a particular place under such conditions, that is evident that the stay, and here's where you finally get the definition, because now you get is staying. So what does stay mean? Da da da. Is intended to be, okay, so here it is intended. So intended means it is another way of looking at the law. Something may happen, but you did not intend it to happen. Is like you got sick and you had to leave. To be of a short duration. So now I've just painstakingly, perhaps boringly even, taken you through what a permanent home means. Or should I say again, what a home, H-O-M-E, means. Because home, so now I'm going to write it in red at the top of your board. The process I'm walking you through is not just, okay, this applies directly to permanent establishments, Article 5, but it also applies to everything, every definition in the treaty that is Article 10, 11, and 12. So when we're looking at interest, royalties, dividends, how you define that, and last week we talked about the dual hybrid instrument and how one country characterizes it interest, another characterizes dividend, and neither gets to tax it or both get to tax it, depending on how you characterize it. And we have to look at the treaty to determine if there's a definition in the treaty that characterizes it as opposed to domestic law. We have to look at our capital gains article, and we have to know what a capital gains is. And we talked about that briefly last week, and I think the week before. And the difference in characterization of that and how one calculates basis and yada yada. So the process, the methodology of definition that I'm walking you through right now is the same process and methodology, directly the same for permanent establishment, which is where a lot of your work is going to rely upon in tax treaties, but also it's the same process for looking at the definitions, any definition in the tax treaty, but most particular 10, 11, and 12, and then the capital gains Article 13 definition, referring to the OECD model, not to the U.S. model treaty in this respect. So home is my term. So my term which I'm abbreviating TM, not for trademark, my term is modified by time. So my term is also modified or defined by, I circled it, 2 words, and the 2 words are, okay, arranged or retained. So I'm drawing lines to the 2 words arranged and retained. Now, and owns and possesses. And then we're going to have the word intended, because something may have happened against the intention of our taxpayer. The taxpayer intended to have a permanent home, gets sick, and is forced to leave. So my home, my term, is where an individual owns or possesses a home. Owns we understand. Owns is you have title. Owns is a legal definition understood internationally and nationally under domestic law. You have title. Owns or possesses. Because many people don't own their home. It's held in trust. Or, in fact, they don't own their home. A bank owns their home under a mortgage agreement or something. But they possess the home. Or they have a long-term rental agreement and they don't have any other place of abode. Now, in my other two words, arranged or retained, the individual must have arranged or retained, owns or possesses, and owns and possesses, I'm going to put a little line there, arranged and retained means the exact same thing as owns or possesses. The exact same thing. Regarding the commentaries, are they sequential as well? I don't exactly understand what you mean by that, Hale. Are they sequential, meaning the commentaries follow exactly the model treaty? They describe the model treaty in exactly the order of the model treaty. They don't jump around. That's why in this interpretation of the model treaty, we're going through this little exercise. The tiebreaker rules are sequential, go through A, then B, then C. Yeah, that's correct, 100%. It's not a totality of rules discussion. That's why we have to look at permanent home. Even as the commentary states, most tiebreaker clauses, tiebreaker problems are going to be solved under the first definition of permanent home. Are the commentaries presented in the same manner? Yes, because the commentaries are not law unto themselves. All they're doing is defining the actual terms of the treaty. They're not giving you new law, at least in theory they're not. Got it. So, arrange and retain don't literally mean, as we know, owns and possess, but they've been given equal standing as owns and possess because it says, that is to say, which means in symbolic logic equals. So I've just drawn that up. You'll see that in a moment on your board. That is to say, equals, the individual must have arranged or retained it for the permanent use. And then now we get our definition of what is time, this time modifier. So, time equals permanent. Permanent equals, I should say does not equal, but it's permanent equals negated. So I negated my equal sign. So you're going to see on the left-hand side of your screen, permanent does not equal as opposed to staying. Staying is not it's not relevant for right now. But it falls in. I'll show you later. At a particular place. Okay. Well, I'll put it up there. So permanent is not staying. They should have said the word like residing, but regardless. Staying at a particular place. So you can't take time and place. time and place are two totally different concepts. Home is place. Home is place. And when we go through the permanent establishment definition, we're going to be using the term place and we're going to be using the term time and going through a long series of descriptions like now to determine their meaning. But anyway, permanent does not equal staying. And then at a particular place. Well, permanent and place, permanent can't equal place. They have no connection. It's apples and oranges. Okay, so staying in a particular place under such condition, that is evident that the stay is intended to be of short duration. So permanent means not a short stay. Permanent equals not staying short duration. Of course, what does short mean? Okay, anyway, if we read on, which naturally we do, the next number 13. Sorry, I have to scroll down. Scroll back up so you can actually see it. As regards the concept of home, it should be observed that any form of home must be taken into account. Any form. This is civil law, finally. Civil law. Home equals anything. Any form of home. So home equals itself. That's not civil law. That would be, nobody in their right mind would write definition equals definition. Term equals term. Well, that's tautologist. That's example. Okay. Any form of home. So, but we can at least glean from this, home means anything then that may be taken into account. House or apartment belonging to or rented by an individual. So this is why I told you earlier that home can be like a condo and so forth like that. My example was your banker lives in a place with just a sleeping bag. Mark says he has to go. No problem. No, 100%. So it's coming up on, we've been in class an hour and a half, so I'm just finishing, usually, I guess, an hour and 40 minutes. So I'll just finish this up, and then you will read on your own the Criterion of Economic Places, yada yada, in the commentary and in your course materials, and from IBLS. And I'm not going to cover that next week. We'll probably move on to permanent establishment with hopefully Alan DeCoker or anyway. As regards the concept of home, so we finally actually get into our definition of home down here. And home is a house or apartment belonging to ownership. So it's an apartment you own, i.e. a condominium. Or rented, so it's a lease agreement by an individual. Rented furnished room, so it can be a one-room place. That means that it can be a share flat. You can have a room shared with somebody else in an apartment. You can even have a rooming house. You can even rent a hostel room. As long as it's furnished. It can't be unfurnished because here, for whatever reason, they stuck the word in, furnished room. But the permanence of the home is essential. So time is what's essential. So what we got in the next clause is, actually, home means just about anything. In fact, the only thing that really matters here, so home, but home can't be a cardboard box out on the street, probably. You can't be homeless, cardboard box. You probably can't be living in a shelter. I mean, that's not really going to happen, right? But to take what it absolutely cannot be from common understanding. Okay, so anyway, permanence. So the whole game is really about time. But the permanence of the home is essential. That means that the individual has arranged to have the dwelling available to him at all times continuously. Continuously is our word. And not occasionally. Continuously means not occasionally. So what does continuously mean? Not occasionally. What does permanent mean? Permanent now means continuously. What does permanent not mean? Occasionally. So I've written this at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it in a moment. And not occasionally for the purposes of the state, which, owing to the reasons for it, is necessarily of short duration. Travel for pleasure, business travel, educational travel, attending a course at school. So, continuously means negated. So, continuously does not equal, exempts from its definition. Occasional is the same meaning as short duration. If you go through the what I've done, so you see that short duration and occasional mean the same thing, so we can replace those words. And short duration or occasional necessarily means travel for pleasure, business travel, educational travel, attending a course at school, etc. So etc. means there are other like definitions of the first four definitions given. So permanent means continuous. Permanent does not meaning permanent negates occasional. Permanent negates short duration, and short duration, occasional means. So permanent negates travel for pleasure, business travel, educational travel, a course at school, and anything like that. I don't need to go to paragraph number 14 because number 14 deals with the next step of paragraph A, and we're not going to do that today. That's the personal economic relations. So here's the conclusion of today's lecture. A permanent home equals not travel for pleasure, business travel, educational travel, attending a course at school, and like functions, as long as there is a place. And a place, though it does not state it specifically, a place probably is not a homeless shelter, but a place is just about everything else. So in fact, as long as you have a place meaning house, apartment belonging to, rented, furnished room, as long as you have a place, any place, then it is a permanent home to you, as long as you intended for it to be a permanent home. It's a permanent home to you as long as you're not using it for purposes of short duration. And short duration, we have a very clear definition of what short duration is now. So even though this isn't perhaps the best this is not the best way to write a statute. This is certainly fails under the civilian code test of how to draft a statute or treaty. This is definitely a common law approach. However, at the end of the day, having read through it, we finally decipher a very clear, still broad line, but clear definition that we can apply to our clients and to a discussion with a revenue official. Now, the revenue official is not going to see the statute the way that you see it. That's obvious because, one, they've imposed tax on you. That's why you have a problem. We discussed that last week. If they saw it the way you saw it, you wouldn't have a problem. There would be no issue. There'd be no tax levied. End of story. Don't collect a fee from client. So they obviously don't see it the way you see it. But number two, they're actually going to believe, step one, Michael Edwards Kerr, that their way is right. What they don't get, because you have to educate them, bill your client, is what we just went through. I know how other programs teach residency and tax treaties and permanent and all what we just did. They do not do it the way I did it. So if you go sit through, by example, the course in Vienna, or you go sit through a Van Rod's course in Leiden, they're going to teach it differently. Obviously they're going to teach it differently, all teachers do, but they're going to teach how you define this term differently too. They're going to teach you that it has a more narrow meaning. I tell you, just like I told you last week when we looked at income and characterization of income, and I said that it's really your duty to make it fit into whatever you need it to fit in for your client, because that's what you're being paid for. I'm giving you some tools at exploring the definition within the reasonable bounds of defining a statute or a treaty term within a normal treaty statutory interpretation, supported by people like Michael Edwards Kerr. What I've done is I've shown you that a term that most people, when you deal with them at this level, are going to think this term is defined not very narrowly, but defined narrowly, and that it has a meaning that is common throughout all societies, and that a home is where your family, that kind of stuff. What I've done is I've now given you the tools to see that this term is not a narrow definition, that this term is actually a very open, expansive definition, but to be very clear, this term is not open to domestic interpretation. This term is not permanent home, is not, the definition is so general that I have to go back to my domestic system to find the meaning. No. Then you miss the point totally. The term is defined, and it is deemed. We saw the word deemed to start off the lecture. D-E-E-M. So this treaty has suppressed your domestic meaning, whatever your domestic meaning is. So that's how you start off talking to the revenue. Not, obviously through your local counselor yourself if you are able to. You start off saying, I'm sorry, but we cannot look at your domestic definition here. I understand that you are right under the domestic step one terminology to impose tax on my client. But your country entered into a tax treaty, and that's what we talked about last week. How do you approach revenue officials? So that's how you start the approach. The second part of the approach. This treaty deems, D-E-E-M. I must define to you what deem means. Deem means do not look at domestic definition. And because I have a definition in the treaty, which is actually, as we've seen, very broad, not narrow, very broad, I'm pretty much going to be able to fit or plan for my client, because hopefully your client has come to you before he or she has done something. He's come to you beforehand so that you can set it up correctly. So you now have a lot of room to fit the facts and circumstances of your planning into what the client most wants. So you basically can just about forget what a home is, because a home's going to be whatever you want it to be within the context of the arranged, rental, furnished room, dwelling, these kind of words, which are very broad. And in terms of permanency, well, permanency does not mean permanency. We know that permanency does not mean what you and I think permanent means, which is I'm going to live there forever and die, because permanency has been defined as not staying short. So permanency is everything. Everything in the class of things, for symbolic logic people, everything in the class of things that is not staying short. And not staying short means, I'll say it one more time, and then I will not repeat it again. Not staying short means travel for pleasure, business travel, educational travel, attending a course at a school, and other similar like things. Everything else is permanent. I promise you, your revenue official or the person you're having a discussion with on the other side of the table will not see it the way that I've just described it to you. They will want to think that permanent means something where you're going to live and die. Something that means 5, 10 years, 12 years. Anything they say, though, is random. That's not the correct English word. Anything they say is a variable. And I'm still not using the correct English word here, but it's whatever they say is not written in stone. It's what they think, because they're anchoring, for those of you who read your career services manual, they are anchoring onto a definition, probably the first definition they were told by their manager, or that they read in some case somewhere, which doesn't apply to our situation anyway, because that's domestic law. But the variable is not constrictive in this situation. The variable is as expansive. That is, it includes everything in the class of things other than what has been negated. And what has been negated, I will not repeat. Okay. That's our how to interpret a treaty and how to interpret a statute at the same time, and also the tiebreaker test. We could go over the other tiebreaker things, but generally speaking, we already read, most tiebreaker tests are going to be solved here and now under this this permanent home test. And I'm going to tell you the greatest support for the reasoning I just used as opposed to what you hear from anybody else. How do I know that what I'm saying is probably correct? What they actually meant versus what people think they meant. Because it says, to start off this commentary, probably all the situations are going to be solved by the first clause of paragraph A. So they think, the redactors think, that it has a broad meaning. Otherwise, they wouldn't put in the clause that states that this meaning probably ends your problem. They would have recognized that if it was a constrictive meaning, that you would probably have to go on to later meanings, such as the economic circumstances test, such as the place of habitual abode test. So, it lends support to what I've told you, that the redactors think that permanent home has a broad meaning that will in general solve all the problems of a tiebreaker test, though not all of the problems. If they thought it solved all the problems, there would be no second clause of paragraph A. There would be no paragraph B or C. Okay, that's the technical end of the lecture. I'm going to close my screen, and I've never lectured this on mega meetings. I usually have a board and PowerPoints on the screen and lots of PowerPoints. But so the board you're looking at is obviously rather messy, and I'm going to actually do a print screen of it myself. But I'm going to make it go away, and this is actually one of the hardest treaty lectures for y'all. Not there's harder treaty lectures, defining interest and stuff, but it's the logic, the actual logic behind definitions. And I can tell you right now, because I know all the other programs out there, nobody teaches you the symbolic logic of statutory interpretation, or logic in general of statutory interpretation. And I don't know why they do, because most of them come from civil law backgrounds and understand it. I was trained civil law before common law. So, okay, I'm opening it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions on what I've covered here? I really hope that this recorded right, because I didn't break it, because I'd have had to close out and would have made everything disappear off the screen. Is there any difference between the process we went through under the U.S. system? Hale, the answer to that is there should not be. There should not be. However, the process we went through is not known by most people. They don't understand statutory interpretation. They don't know how to do it, especially not government people who have not been through a proper training. They haven't been to an LLM program, much less they're probably not lawyers or accountants to start off with. And accountants don't get this training ever in their schools. So the answer is it should be, but they don't know, and you need... yeah, that's why they work for the government. That's why, like, you have an IRS agent who's one of your colleagues, and you should talk to him. Look in the social bios. So he can't come to class, Nick Whitmire, because he's not allowed during the day, because he's at the IRS office, to access sites outside. I don't know. That's just the rule. So, but you can talk to him about what they learn. But what's neat for y'all is that, okay, now, I mean, you knew this from law school anyway. I don't know if they taught you statutory interpretation at law school. They taught it at my law school because I went to a civil law school. And I went to another civil law school in Holland. And then I practiced in South Africa, where logic is the way you approach every statutory interpretation. But regardless, in common law, they do teach statutory interpretation slightly differently. But what I've taught you is correct. It's the correct way. You may need to educate the other side. That's all. You have to educate them, because their initial thought is going to be to repeat to you what they heard, and what they heard is what their manager told them. And their manager told them because their manager heard it from their manager 20 years ago. Or it's in an IRS. I'll give you a good example of this in money laundering. The FFIEC manual is not law. It's not even regulation. However, all the agents doing anti-money laundering checks use it because it's what they've been given to use, and it's what the regulators have agreed to use. However, it is the regulators' approach, their thoughts on how anti-money laundering U.S. Patriot Act should be interpreted. It's not law. In fact, one shouldn't even need to apply statutory interpretation to it, since it has no force of law. One needs to apply statutory interpretation to the actual statutes to then determine whether what the regulators have written coincides with what the law is, which is technically what we do with tax regulations. If you're in U.S. Tax 1 for the U.S., regulations are not the law. The code is the law. Regulations are an interpretation by the Treasury Department of what they think the code means. But because we've given regulations a prima facie legal effect, we need to interpret them the way that I've just interpreted the code. IRS agents, more times than not, do not interpret regulations, much less the code. But they don't even look at the code. They look at the regulations. They look at so they interpret the regulations in whatever way they've been told to interpret them that is best for their position. But it's not real interpretation. I've seen it over and over again. With the money laundering people, I'm now seeing it over and over again. That they're not interpreting anything. They're imposing, they are deeming, D-E-E-M, they are deeming a definition that has little to do with the actual regulation or the actual code article, or for the anti-money laundering people, for the FFIC manual, has little to do with it. And that cannot be drawn from a logic approach. And it's wrong. It's just wrong. However, you're going to lose your argument every time unless you explain to them in not a pejorative, in not a demeaning manner, explaining to them by sharing them education. You're going to have to share with them your educational approach to educate them, to enlighten them of how the law really is, because if we don't apply the rule of law, then we're all lost. Back to Shakespeare. Kill all the lawyers so society falls apart. And so the IRS, unfortunately, with many of its laws, no longer applies the rule of law because it doesn't support its position a lot of times, but mainly probably because they just aren't educated. And I don't mean they're dumb. I mean they're ignorant of statutory interpretation because they don't have highly qualified attorneys with lots of experience doing this stuff. They have quite the opposite, because when you become a highly qualified attorney, you leave the IRS and go work for big money, as we all know. So there's very few what we call true, people who work the IRS their lifers, like Larry Fedro. Larry Fedro worked the IRS 37 years, who teaches your civil tax procedure course. He knows statutory interpretation applies it. Okay. If y'all don't have any other questions, I'm going to sign off. Okay. Thank you kindly.